Thank you. So I'm going to start by saying I'm not sure who put these in order because I feel greatly disadvantaged following those two talks. So thank you for those really impressive stories and summaries. Mine's more about politics. Those of you who are certified in the last 10 years or so may be aware that we changed the recertification standards. It seemed to me at one point in time that all 60,000 certified surgeons in the country were in fact aware, and each one of them had called, written, or emailed me. But that may or may not be the case. So I'll tell you the story as it came along. So I've worked at the board full-time since, actually it's my disclosure slide. I'm a salaried employee of the American Board of Surgery, so my perspective may be skewed by that. I'm also a volunteer director of the American Board of Medical Specialties, which is the Uber board that all the rest of the boards are required to report up to. It's a 24 specialty board that includes pediatrics, radiology, all the other specialties that we think of, something that I was completely unaware of until I became a director of the American Board of Surgery, that we've got a whole bunch of peer organizations that we are integrally intertwined with, and as their fates go, so do ours as well. So I worked at the board as the director of evaluation since 2009, and then when there was a change of leadership, which was driven by a strong desire of the 38 directors of the American Board of Surgery to have some change. And as the internal candidate, I also felt very strongly that we needed change. In fact, at my final interview, I said, I want to make these changes, and if you're not ready to come along with me, you should not hire me. And they said, go faster. So we had a burning platform, which was the whole issue of recertification, maintenance of certification. Not quite as much in surgery, but the 300,000 internal medicine doctors were very unhappy with the process by which they were recertified, which is different than ours, and also unhappy with their leadership, and had taken to state legislative actions, lawsuits against the board, and were really dramatically changing the landscape and forcing some introspection on what value certification and recertification really did offer, as opposed to something that we just accepted by fiat. So just a short background, the American Board of Surgery started certifying people in 1935. The first board was actually ophthalmology in 1917, and it was really a point-in-time assessment of knowledge and skills developed over time, reflecting training. It really was a period of the Wild West, where what it meant to be a surgeon was anybody's guess. You could have done a preceptorship, you could have done one of the few residencies that were available, you could have gone over in Europe and followed someone around and carried their bags, but all you really had to do is hang out a sign and say that you were a surgeon. Patients didn't know the difference, hospitals didn't know the difference, there was really no distinguishing. So a pretty bold group of men got together, and from the college, the American Surgical, and the AMA, and decided that they should set a set of standards to protect the public and enhance the profession. That was the mission statement, the original mission statement of the American Board of Surgery. I think of that every day. So 1935 to 77, that was the way it was. Single point in time, assessed your skills, training, and knowledge up to that point. And actually, for a long time, there was actually an observed patient interaction, a pathology, lab evaluation, but pretty quickly that became unmanageable and they stopped doing it. In 1977, started to recognize that maybe a single point in time, the idea that you carried the certificate that you had earned 30 years ago wasn't exactly fulfilling our obligation to protect the public. We had thought of it, I think, as the equivalent of a bachelor's degree or an MD, but it wasn't really being used that way. It was being used by stakeholders as saying that your surgeon was up to date, and we weren't sure that we could say that based on something that had happened a long time ago. Started instituting the 10-year exam and a few more frequent interventions, up-to-date operative logs, peer evaluations, and then in 2005, ever escalating, ever more frequent intersections with the board. And this was all done in parallel with the American Board of Medical Specialties. All boards were doing this at about the same time. Required CME reporting, participation in an outcomes database, and then pretty quickly, you can see that the timeframes of reassessment and looking at our own internal quality standards are tightening. We started to say, does 10 years really make sense? I don't know about you, but when I rounded in the ICU a couple of months ago, medical student gave one of those incredibly detailed presentations, and there was not a single medication and not a single significant procedure that patient undergone that existed 10 years ago. And so as a leader of the board, I no longer felt comfortable saying that that 10-year certificate was something that I could really stand behind. We also had diplomates saying, I'm really irritated that I am a breast surgeon and yet to pass this exam I have to read esophageal surgery over and over again. There was a small core of intellectual nerds, myself included, that enjoyed studying and catching up and figuring out what other people were doing. But a lot of people were already sort of pedal to the metal in terms of how much time they spent in their practice, trying to stay up to date with what they were doing. They really did not want to learn things that were not directly pertinent to their care, and there's a lot of validity to that. They also hated going to Pearson centers. They hated the period of time for study. They hated the cost and expense of studying, the time away from practice, and they didn't like getting fingerprinted when they went into an exam center, all of which is kind of funny because when Pearson centers started, they were the best thing since sliced bread because you didn't have to go to one of 5 ballroom centers on one specific day and fill in bubble graphs. But times change. People didn't like the Pearson centers. They didn't like the general exam. Stakeholders started to challenge the validity. It wasn't so much that they questioned surgery certification and continuous or recertification, but we would talk to CMS about reimbursement and say, you should give board certified surgeons a higher reimbursement rate. They're better. And they'd say, well, board certification, I don't know, it looks a little different. Radiologists are doing one thing, you're doing another thing. Medicine's got 60% of their people have a lifelong certificate. What the heck does it mean anyway? So we didn't have a global standard that certification actually meant the same thing. So the government wanted a single stamp, the quality groups wanted a single stamp, international organizations, as they started to look at our training system and certification, which is arguably felt to be the best in the world, started to say, well, wait, it's not the same across specialties. In some cases, that makes sense because there's specialty-specific stuff, but in other cases, maybe it doesn't. So stakeholder challenges. We started to realize that, the science of adult learning, intermittent, more frequent reinforcement, smaller quizzes, immediate feedback, all these things are better for knowledge retention and probably a more reasonable assessment of knowledge. And then, of course, the way that we all practice, carrying our smartphones with us, knowing what it is you need to look up, starting your office hours by putting up-to-date up on your screen and whatever other resources you have, and looking things up as you go along, started to make it look like that whole memorization thing didn't make quite as much sense, at least not as the sum total of everything. So why change? And then the board, as with so many historic societies, can be ponderous in its rate of change. And if you would like to kill change, may I suggest that you have a retreat about it. We had a retreat in 2013, we had another one in 2016, we had another one in the second half of 2016, and another one in 2017, but none of them had a goal. None of them had actionable items. They were all sort of thinking great thoughts and pondering, and they didn't get us anywhere. And then I was elected with the burning platform. So I was elected, we had a nice dinner, everybody was super nice to me on Sunday, and then we had the board meeting on Wednesday, and 38 directors said, we want a different maintenance of certification exam this time next year. And I'd spent 10 years as the director of evaluation, and I looked back at them, I said, that's not possible. And they said, if you were in private industry, you would make that happen without a doubt, and we expect you to do so. So 38 pairs of steely eyes, make that change happen this year, and we were off and running. We started off by we figured we better figure out what it is that people really think is valuable. Sent out a survey. Not surprisingly, people wanted it to be more practice related. They wanted it to be more flexible, not that sort of 1 day, 5 hours in which your whole career pivoted and you might lose your job because you weren't board certified anymore. And then we wanted to figure out sort of what was tolerable in terms of frequency. We actually thought it was more like once a year was probably reasonable. That was not felt to be tolerable by most of our diplomates. So we used that survey information, and then we put together what we called a sprint team, which was a volunteer group of directors who met by phone every other week and in person every month to start to craft what we thought the response would look like. So that happened from August through October of that year, and then we had an implementation team, which was the group in the office, the IT people, the communications people, the exam development experts, the psychometricians, to turn the 30,000-foot view into actual, we're going to send out a registration, you're going to click on it, and now you're going to be able to take the new assessment. So it was multiple levels of engagement, diplomate, directors, and staff. And it seemed like we really had it right. We had gotten a lot of input. We had a lot of agreement about what the right thing to do was. It included more frequent assessment. And key to the more frequent assessment was that we were pretty sure that everybody would agree with us. We thought everybody, it was like the myth of the great argument. Everybody knows that what you were doing 10 years ago doesn't make any more sense, so we're going to shorten the duration. We'll have a little lead-in period. It'll be, in 3 years, everyone will be enrolled in the new assessment, which they're going to like better because it's less stress. You can take it at home. It's fewer questions. It's practice pertinent. All of that made perfect sense to us, and then we rolled it out. We can watch that a couple of times because that's kind of how it went for me. And it did not go well at all. So my inbox was flooded. I got secret late-night phone calls from other leaders of major surgical societies saying, "Are you sure you really want to do it this way? Because we're not sure we can support you." A lot of hostile messaging. I don't know if any of you know Mark Frager. He's not even a surgeon, but he posted every single day about MOC. But if you know him, can you give me his phone number? Because I would like to talk to him. So we announced it and immediately got negative feedback. This is a money grab. Why are you increasing my certification? I just spent $1,600 last year plus $5,000 studying for it. You're ripping me off. You didn't think about us. You're talking from an ivory tower. It went on and on. We had a few people who did like the idea, but there's one on the left side of the page and 4, including Mark Frager, on the right side of the page, and it sort of went on and on. We started deploying directors to go out to every meeting, to every regional surgical society. I have to say the directors marched in lockstep. They were fantastic, and it continues to be a daily privilege to me to work with that group of people who volunteer between 25 and 30 days a year for 6 years for absolutely nothing other than maybe a little prestige, maybe a little camaraderie, and the opportunity to stand up when something like this happens. So we would send them out, and you can see us sort of starting to back off. The ABS appreciates the comments we've received from the diplomats regarding the new continuous certification. We'll continue to gather feedback. So I gained about 10 pounds in stress eating. And we weren't really sure what the right thing to do was. We had lawsuits happening on the American Board of Internal Medicine side. It was possible we were going to lose the whole professional self-regulation, protect the public, enhance the profession story on the one pitch that it had to be more frequent and that it had to be more frequent for everybody right now. Frankly, I still think that that was the right decision, but an awful lot of really smart people, my friends, colleagues, other leaders, they all agree with it in theory, but they didn't agree with it for them. They wanted to let their certificate run out. They felt that we had a contract with them, that we had made a deal with them. They had planned on that. And in due time, they'd be ready to roll in. And so we took a deep swallow, got all the feedback we could, kind of went back to the drawing board, figured out which parts of the program were the most important to us, and we felt strongly that it was the more frequent intersection and the immediate feedback, sort of being able to target topics of importance, of urgent importance, the opioid epidemic, stop the bleed, and that buy-in across the board was going to be more important than standing on our principle that everybody should roll in sooner rather than later. So in the end, over 2,000 people did take it. Usually in a given year, about 1,500 to 1,800 people take the recertification exam. So a lot of people sort of stepped in out of curiosity. We had 4 different modules, matched your practice. It's 40 questions. You could take it at home. And I'll just go through these quickly because you can see that the blue, everything shifted to the right. The blue is the post-evaluations, the light blue is the pre. Everybody thought it was more relevant to their practice. People thought it would improve their practice. They thought it was a fair assessment of their knowledge. They thought that it was timely. Everything shifted to the right. People said that they planned to change something in their practice. They'd recommend it to colleagues. Those are like the holy grail of assessment and feedback. It would change something in my practice. I took it myself. I finished it, and I thought, that wasn't that bad. I learned something, and it's going to change the way I practice in at least one arena. And that's exactly what I wanted across the board. So you'll forgive me if I have to put up some of the positive feedback we got, because we then got an avalanche in social media, letters, and phone calls to the board office. We actually, during all this, hired a woman whose only job was to answer the phone calls from people calling about continuous certification. Why that woman didn't quit in the first month, I have no idea, but she's still there. And now people call and ask for her by name. Her name's Marie, to thank her. And then we just, as bad as the initial feedback had been, it was continuously positive. And I want to just draw your attention to the upper left one. I want to thank Dr. Buyske and the staff for having the foresight and courage. And I'm going to say that that would never have happened if we hadn't had the first explosion, right? If we had just proposed it and everyone had accepted it, a lot of people might not even have noticed. But because we had that first awful explosion, which frankly I would not want to live through again, there was a lot of attention to it, and we listened, and people knew that we listened. So we went from being this sort of opaque Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, to people who were actually interested in doing the right thing and working with the diplomates and sharing. And in the end, I'll come back to where we are today, most of the surgical societies put out statements in support of continuous certification because they felt, even the people who'd called me and worried about it early on, felt that we'd done the right thing by starting in what we thought was the right place, listening to the feedback that we got, changing our stand sort of for the greater good and moving it forward. So I guess if I had to do it over again, that moment where they all locked eyes with me and said, you got to do this right away and you have to do it now, sometimes I look back and think, was that a mistake? And then I think, no, I needed that burning platform to change everything, put a lot of stress on the office. I don't think we would have gotten where we got now if they hadn't told me to do it in a hurry. And I'm not sure we would have recognized that mistake if we'd had more time. So I think it all rolled out the way that it was supposed to, and it was a really, really good learning experience. The most interesting part to me being that the high visibility and trauma was actually part of what made it most successful in the very end.